Welcome back to Season 7 of the ReidConnect-Ed podcast. Today, Alexis and I are going to talk about the topic of athlete mental health. Through the Olympics of 2026, there's been a lot of talk about athlete mental health. It's been a topic of which many athletes, elite athletes, have been really speaking out about. I'm not going to go into personal stories. That's really their stories to share, but I will just say in general, the topic of athlete mental health has certainly become more destigmatized over the past decade or so, which is a great thing. It doesn't mean that it's destigmatized everywhere. It's certainly still, I would say, even a misunderstood topic. And so today, Alexis and I, we're going to try to really get into the details and the nuances of answering questions like, what is mental health anyway? If we're going to talk about athlete mental health, we also have to try to define and understand what is mental health first and foremost. We're also going to talk about the unique experience of athletes in terms of how it could contribute or facilitate mental health or mental health challenges. It's certainly a unique experience that athletes have that I think we need to get into the nuances of, what that really is like, the lived experience of these athletes that I get to work with a lot and that you'll see in media outlets talking about the mental health experiences of athletes. And then we're going to talk about just generally what could parents, coaches, and athletes really do to support their mental health, over the course of their career. And, I want to also make a note that after their career, it's equally as important, in terms of people being involved in sports, because if you're an athlete, at some point there's going to be some sort of, ending, a demarcation of their participation in a structured sport environment and being part of a team. Sometimes you can elongate that in different ways of your life, but certainly there tends to be an ending. And so athletes' mental health is very, very important afterwards as well as during their participation in sports.
This is such an important topic, Jer, because I think we often look at an athlete's performance as just the way they're performing in that particular sport. But we don't really zoom out as much to think about the bigger picture of how this individual is functioning across different aspects of life. And mental health, as we often talk about, is really the driving force in being able to do anything well and feel well. And the other piece too is when we're thinking about young elite athletes, oftentimes they're often students as well, right? How do we balance the academic and the athletic life while also maintaining our mental health and remembering all the different roles and parts of ourselves as athletes are navigating through this more intense, sports-driven part of the world?
You got to think about kids who get involved in sports early on. I'm sure you're not going to hear of a child who's like 4 years old saying, I want to be on the sports team so that I get admiration and I get to be on social media. I mean, maybe nowadays that might be more possible, unfortunately. But, the reason people get involved in sports at an early age tends to be different than what the motivations can become over time as things like the professionalism of sports gets involved, as things like the pressures involved, even monetary compensation about, having a career through sports and making money and income. So there's definitely a change in experience that happens. So you're hitting on a good point.
And it's so interesting. And I want everybody out there in the audience to consider their own context and remember that your context is just one, right? Your family, you as an individual, you as an athlete might take on a certain persona, a certain aspect or flair of what's going on for you. But as I say in education a lot, every single individual is entering into an environment with different expectations, different experiences, different cultural beliefs, right, that come into play as you are stepping into the role as an athlete.
Absolutely. And I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but you're making a very good point that, people bring in certain beliefs, and that does really determine whether or not someone, A, acknowledges that there could be mental health concerns, and also whether or not that there's a ability to really accept help or to seek out help. I'll get into what mental health is, but I just want to kind of set the stage is that in terms of mental health challenges, like things like anxiety, depression, at a high level, where it's really distressing and impairing to someone's functioning, that, there's research that says elite athletes, their experience with that is comparable to the general population. And the reason for that is because they are humans first, athletes second. And so why should we really care about athlete mental health? Well, as you're pointing out, there could be different beliefs and different cultural backgrounds. And the culture of sport really is its own culture in some ways. I mean, it'll differ from team to team, from sport to sport, and from community to community. But, there certainly is research that suggests if you look at the elite athletes, which you think, oh, they're healthy, they're mentally healthy, they're performing so well, they're at the top of their game, they're doing the best in the world, they're in the Olympics. It turns out that, their mental health is about the same as the general population. Why is that? Well, because they're humans first, athletes second. They are human beings. They're not, some bionic beings that don't have a heart, don't have a mind, right? Don't have relationships. Like they're human beings, and they happen to be athletes too, and they perform at a high level. So, and there's also other aspects of the context of sport we'll get into, but certainly that there is this mental health challenges that could come with even at the top of the hierarchy in terms of elite athletes. And as you mentioned, beliefs, like they're also less likely to seek help. The population of people who are elite athletes and involved in athletics, as much as they have challenges like everybody else, they're less likely to seek out help. So we'll talk more about that as well.
And the better you get, sometimes the more stress and pressure comes with it, right? As Mom always says, be careful what you wish for, because the greater you step into your strengths, your power, your expertise, often a lot more comes along with that. And we're not always prepared for it. Right. So today, since Jerry has such a great expertise in sports psychology and thinking about mental health in general, I'm going to kind of take the role more of an interviewer, so this doesn't turn too much into a lecture for the audience out there, though maybe that's what you need. But we're going to try to do a nice balance between having a conversation about some of this, drawing upon both of our expertise, but really tapping into this broader conversation about what mental health is. So let's get started. So, okay, Jerry, in this world of social media and in our current day and age here in 2026, I hear so often that a lot of diagnoses, labels, conversations about mental health are really a part of like the common vernacular these days because information is so readily accessible. So many people, whether they have expertise in mental health or not, post about it on social media. And a lot of young people are starting to develop the language around understanding mental health. And in my opinion, I see both the benefits of getting clear on like what's happening in our lives, in our worlds, in our minds, in our hearts. And then also, maybe the detriment of speaking too much about mental health and not always being clear exactly about what you're describing and talking about. So I kind of want to like pull the veil back a little bit, right? Like reveal the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain to think about, okay, when we talk about mental health, what are we really addressing here? Why is it so important to keep in the conversation, but be careful not to get into like clinical terms too quickly or in like common conversation without an expert or a therapist or somebody to guide you in better understanding what's happening in terms of your mental health. Yeah.
So to summarize, your question is, with this increased awareness about mental health, particularly in athletics and in society in general, what are kind of the pros and cons of being so aware that there could be mental health concerns?
Yes.
And I'll start off by saying that, in unison with this happening, the greater awareness of mental health, that there's actually been also an increase of mental health challenges. Some would say, is that partially due to more awareness, that we are more forthcoming about the challenges we have as human beings? And or is there something else? Is there other reasons? In my opinion, you can have mental health challenges and someone could make you aware of it. But as you said in the beginning, everybody is so unique and different, right? Every human being is different in terms of who they are as a person, their relationships, their environment, the demands they have, the resources they have, right? So if someone's going to talk about and raise awareness about mental health, I think it's very useful to destigmatize it and to help bring awareness, but it doesn't mean that what they're sharing is going to match exactly your experience. So let's say, okay, someone's talking about having anxiety, and let's say they use journaling for it, or they use, breathing techniques, right? And that's helped them. And that's kind of like the only thing they share about what's their journey of mental health with anxiety is. Like, there's plenty of people I work with where like that is a tool that is therapeutic, but that's not necessarily the therapy to work through what the anxiety is about and where it came from and what's contributing to it. So I think with this awareness is wonderful. Like, it's great to be tuned into challenges that we have. And at the same time, the journey of dealing with your own mental health is very individualized. Even in terms of the treatments that we use, there's a lot of different types of therapies out there, or, clinical approaches. So I think that could be a challenge. It's well-intended, bring more awareness. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think it's hard to realize that, it may not have all the answers for someone. And that's kind of an individual journey that hopefully someone can discover and resolve within themselves through professional help that could be useful for them.
It's funny. Can you remember when you took your Psych 101 course in undergrad? And anybody out there in the audience too, think about if you've ever taken like a Psychology 101 undergraduate course, right? And I always joke, even with my clients now who are in those courses, that you cannot think that everything you're learning about is something that you're experiencing in that moment, right? Because there might be characteristics of some of these psychological diagnoses or situations or challenges that you might experience, because in our human lives, our human selves, we do go through this range of emotions, experiences, and aspects of life. But it reminds me of that, right? Where you're like, oh, I'm learning about this. It must be this. And then all of a sudden you're in your friendships or relationships and you're, throwing around terms like gaslighting or, coping mechanisms because you just learned about it. So sometimes that piece of awareness, again, can get us to think a little bit more clearly about some things, but sometimes it could also muddy the waters, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's almost like a door opener, right? It opens the door to possibilities, and what you do with that, is going to determine kind of, how things progress. You make such a good point about, you taking your first Psych 101 class and, diagnosing yourself or diagnosing everybody in your life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not malintended. It's not intended in a bad way. It's like, curiosity and hope that there can be help. At the same time, the thing about learning about mental health, quote unquote disorders, right, is that the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is essentially, these are what the diagnoses are, these are the symptoms, and here's how you qualify for a mental health diagnosis. It is descriptive in nature, meaning that, okay, I can have a person I work with who is an athlete, right, and they could qualify for, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, which means there's this tremendous amount of worry that's hard to control and impairs their life. Now, any disorder in the manual, right, here that we use to diagnose, it's descriptive. So, one of the challenges of being a therapist is it doesn't explain why for this person they have developed this quote unquote disorder. It doesn't explain why for this person they have developed these symptoms. And so I think that's another important point. And it goes back to what I was saying before. It's great that people can be aware, okay, I feel like I have significant anxiety that's impairing my life. That's, mentally unhealthy. Right? It doesn't feel right. It feels like it's impacting my life. That's great. The first step is acknowledging you have a problem, and then you can do something about it. But at the same time, like, it doesn't actually get into the nuances. And that's why I absolutely, genuinely love my job, and I love supervising students, because you get into the journey of an individual. And therapy, for me, the best part is to try to understand all the nuances of a person, what makes them who they are, what experiences they've had, how they have perceived their experiences, and to really just understand what makes them tick, what makes them motivated, what makes them happy, sad, anxious, worried, angry, upset, guilty, shameful, right? All these things that as a society, we don't really take time to ponder and reflect upon, as we talked about in our previous episode with Dr. Marianne Wolf about reading. Reading is a wonderful thing because it slows us down and you get to process and really reflect and think critically. Therapy is the same thing. Slow down and really get to know yourself and understand yourself. And it's not a quick fix. And it's not a simple thing, right? So it's a process. So again, like kind of back to your question, the awareness is wonderful. And at the same time, as people are sharing their stories and athletes share their stories, that's great. And maybe some of the parts of their stories resonates with yours. At the same time, your journey and, what's going on for you could be very unique to you as well. And that's a whole process to understand for yourself, which, is where the healing and the growth comes from. That's what I really think. I always say to my students is like, you got to really get to the point of understanding where they got stuck and what they need to get unstuck. And it's not always clear. And it's not just labeling them and saying, okay, we're going to treat you like this. You're really going to get into the nuances of like, where do they get stuck? How do they get stuck? What are all the factors that influence that? And what's one of the most important factors kind of help pull them out of it, help them pull themselves out of it and to heal, to grow, to evolve as a person. That's a process for people,
I heard you say in your response that, if there was an athlete who was diagnosed with generalized anxiety, and I felt myself have a visceral reaction to that, thinking and maybe worrying like, okay, if an athlete hears that they have a diagnosis of anxiety, that might actually move them further away from getting the help that they need. Right? It might actually be like, okay, I need to hide this and get through it and just push through this rather than seeking help because, not even thinking about stigma, but thinking about like any kind of challenge that one might experience, especially as an athlete. It might feel like it's something that's debilitating them or working against them or something that might be seen as a weakness instead of a strength. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about like when an athlete is experiencing some kind of distress. Like how do they know what is potentially harmful or something that's workable? Or how do you even know where to start in this journey, in this process, especially, in an athlete's mind? I am not a sports psychologist myself. I've studied a lot of sports psychology and I've worked with a lot of elite athletes as well. And obviously for more of the educational side of things, but there's also this like mental toughness that a lot of these athletes have. Like, I just need to get through this. I just need to push through. I'll be fine. I just need to work harder. Right. And there's this mentality, whether it's instilled in them or not, regardless of the culture, sometimes it's just like their drive. So if they're noticing that there are higher levels of distress or different periods of anxiety that are impacting them, like, what would you even like say to them? Like what maybe like a little voice on their shoulder should be whispering to them to help them not necessarily even get through it, but figure out what to do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing, that I'll say is that mental health is kind of a continuum, instead of thinking like I have a mental health disorder or not, you can just think of, your lifetime being like, okay, at some points I'm going to be maybe mentally more unhealthy or mentally more healthy. And it's a spectrum, right? And it could fluctuate and different aspects of your mental health could fluctuate depending on what's going on in your life. But think of it as a spectrum, I think, to destigmatize it for yourself. If you, feel like the label is kind of stigmatizing, even though it shouldn't be. But if it is, think of it more as a spectrum. And look, there's kind of signs, right? And you made a very good point. Athletics is such a unique context because you get rewarded for doing things that in typical life could be considered unhealthy. So, think about that. And this is not unique to sports. There's other, sectors of society where this happens. I'm not saying that it's all bad. I'm not like telling coaches not to push their athletes and try to get the most out of their potential, right? That's part of what makes sports so magical and so incredible, inspiring, and some people actualize things in themselves that they would have never, right, without the context of sport. There's amazing things that happen in sport and the bonding that could happen, right? but it's not always the case. And so, an athlete can look for red flags. They can look for signals that this is more than just me not feeling confident. This is more than me just having a bad game. And coaches and parents could look out for this too. Mental health, there's two aspects you want to really look at is how intense is the distress they're feeling. Distress is not just like I'm a little nervous before a game and I have some butterflies and those go away after the game starts, right? You might use a sports psychology consultant, someone who kind of focuses on mental skills, performance skills, which are basically things like goal setting, visualization, positive self-talk, ways to kind of, focus on the present moment when you're performing. These are sports psychology consultant skills that could be used to deal with, distress that's not really impairing their life. It's not really at a significant level where it's beyond what would be expected in a given situation. So, like I said, it's not just some butterflies or some doubts or getting mad at yourself if you miss a shot, right? That's kind of normative athletic behavior. It's like if you're not upset that you miss a shot, you probably don't care. It's kind of, expected to feel that, right? As you said, we all have normal emotions that we all experience because we're human, and that's part of being an athlete too, right? But when it comes to becoming mentally unhealthy is, certain signs of the distress becomes disproportionate. So, is the person ruminating for long periods of time, thinking about an upcoming game or reflecting on a past game? And that's really all they think about. It's just constant rumination, going back in time and being like, oh, if I only did this, if I only did that. And as I work with people, it's even deeper than just thoughts. It's like beliefs, oh, now that I failed my team, I let my coach down, or, the fans are, looking down on me, right? There's so many deeper things than just being upset, right? And the rumination is just, it's elongated. It's just like all they think about. It could be intrusive in their mind. It could just be constantly, being upset. And that could lead into behaviors that are really not functional and actually dysfunctional in terms of their life. And things like, things that could look healthy on the surface, like, oh, look, they're getting into the gym early now because they had a bad game, and they're working harder and they're taking responsibility for it, and they're saying, I got to do better. And when I'm talking about athlete mental health and becoming mentally unhealthy, I'm talking about what's underneath that. Because sometimes that could be healthy. That could be, that's like a mature individual. They're taking responsibility. They know they got to try to, improve from their bad game, whatever. But when we talk about athlete mental health, it's deeper than that, right? It becomes, oh my God, I am not a valuable human being. I have no worth to my team. Or, my career is going to be ending because I had one bad game. And, it's all they think about is like the catastrophes that are looming because they didn't have a good game or whatever it is. This is one example. They could start to have changes in their eating habits. They may not sleep well because they're up all night thinking about it, which has a whole downstream effect of like, you don't sleep, you're probably prone to injuries. Like there's so much that goes into that. But
I'm also thinking of like, the shame and embarrassment cycle that can come from that too, that reinforces these behaviors, again, that on the surface look like you're doing something well, but really it's deflecting from, the thing that didn't go well.
Yeah. I mean, the shame is the right word, right? It's like, you're looking at something like, okay, I made a mistake, and you're just kind of obsessing over it, right? It becomes an obsession, really. And like I said, it's like, you look at someone, like we're here in Boston, like Dustin Pedroia was like one of the most beloved Red Sox players, and he would show up early before everybody else. I know from what I heard or from what I read, he'd show up really early before practice before he was there. And like, that's celebrated. That's like, we look up to that. But, I don't know him personally, but like, there could be other athletes who are doing the same behavior, and that could be celebrated without really understanding that beneath the surface, it's driven by a deep sense of fear, non-intention. And we want to go back, if you want to go back to the perfectionism episode we had, with Dr. Ellen Hendrickson, we really talked about, is what you're doing driven by intense fear of failure, fear of shame, fear of not being loved, unconditionally cared for, feeling like you have to have value only by what you do for another person, everything's transactional, everything, or do you feel grounded in yourself, so much so that what you're doing is intentional and has meaning to you and it's based on your values? Again, I don't want to, overemphasize other people's stories, but Alyssa Liu in, the figure skating world exemplified exactly that. If you want to read up on her story.
I think it's really interesting. And it goes back to the question I always ask in the UDL world is like, what's the goal, right? Like, what am I actually trying to do? Am I compensating because I'm afraid I'm not good enough? Or am I recognizing that, this is a good routine for me to build my skills and to provide feedback to myself to figure out what to do next. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And it's actually very important to pay attention to, especially for young athletes. Mm-hmm. I'm going to bring it in here, right? Their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet.
Yes.
So they might think, right, like, oh, I need to do all these things because this is the appropriate response to not performing the best or not performing where people expected me to. Mm-hmm. So they might go in this incredibly like other end of the spectrum and push themselves so hard without realizing, the unintended consequences, right? They might be doing things that make a lot of sense, but it might be helping them to cover up, again, this embarrassment, the shame, and their brains aren't developed enough to be able to determine, what actually is good for me. Yeah. What is going to help me in the short term? What's going to help me in the long term? Mm-hmm. How might this impact other aspects of my life if I'm just going to go full throttle? And what could that mean in the future? And I think, and I imagine, I don't know the stats on this, but I imagine that might also be where a lot of athletes might injure themselves by pushing themselves too hard in response to something that maybe didn't go the way they expected or wanted it to.
That is exactly right. I mean, and you look at stress, having too much anxiety and stress puts more people more at risk of getting injured. You want to throw in an injury that you already have and you're recovering from an injury, right? You try to push yourself too hard because maybe you feel like you don't have value. You feel like you have to prove yourself. You have to, rush the process because you don't feel confident in yourself. That's also going to put you at risk for an injury. But you made an important point, like this is, we're talking about kind of regulating yourself, about kind of coping, in a way that's effective. And if you can't kind of pull back, see the big picture and process your emotions and process what's happening, you can just kind of fall into these habits. And these habits, like I said, could look positive and be celebrated, but they could be, not actually adaptive. And, we talked about perfectionism, like trying too hard or like working yourself beyond your limits to the point of exhaustion or burnout or just not even enjoying what you're doing anymore. I mean, we work with sometimes amazing athletes who they're doing great, but they don't enjoy it at all, right? And so that's not what we're looking for. What is the point of doing this in the first place? But I also want to say the flip side of being a perfectionist, two sides of the same coin, rather, should I say. There's two sides of the same coin of being a perfectionist. You can cope with your insecurities and the deep anxieties that you have by trying harder, trying too hard, pushing yourself too hard. The flip side of that coin is you can do less and you can tank. And imagine what that does to the people around you when you're on a team and you have these challenges internally that nobody understands about all this, self-worth, identity, and fears, and depressive thoughts, and burnout, and sleep, all these things, right? And imagine they feel like, well, I might as well just not try. If I don't try, well, maybe I can't get blamed because at least I didn't try.
Self-fulfilling prophecy comes up a lot. I see it a lot in education, where it's like, well, if I don't try that hard, then I won't be blamed for this because it was just a lack of whatever. Yeah, it's so interesting. It's so true.
You can blame you're basically protecting yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of what depression is. If you think about it in some ways, depression could be, I'm so afraid of something that's upsetting me that I'd rather stop caring. I'd rather stop caring than put myself out there and try and fail. It's protective, right? And think about what that does to the people around you when you stop trying. What happens? Coaches, what's wrong with you? You're not trying hard enough. You're weak. And all of a sudden it becomes this terrible spiral when, if we were to think about this from the lens of mental health and being mentally healthy, it could be that this person has some deep stuff going on that they're just not processing. They don't even know about it. They start to think, oh yeah, maybe I'm lazy. Maybe I am just this terrible person that doesn't care and is a bad teammate, right? But this is why it's really important for people to get help and to look at these signs and maybe to reinterpret what might be happening. Is this a difficult kid? Is this a difficult athlete? Or is there something going on internally that they're protecting themselves? Even being like overconfident and being abrasive and putting people down, to me, a lot of times is a way to protect themselves from their own insecurities. And sometimes that culture of putting people down in the sports world is celebrated.
Yeah.
Oh, he's the tough guy. He's popular. Oh, we're all chirping each other, right? When does it become healthy, normative? When does it become, this is actually feeding into people's mental health challenges?
Yeah, not to mention the hazing aspect of things that we had an episode on, thinking about how it can turn in a completely different direction and really impact people in a terrible way. But as you're describing all of this, I'm thinking too, not just about coping mechanisms, but also thinking about how a lot of people can wear different masks, right? They can either, let their depression and their apathy or their sadness or grief for not doing as well as they want to kind of shine in a way to protect them. Like nobody expects as much from them when they're not doing well.
Yeah.
But then the other side of the coin, and a lot of athletes have talked about this in the media, where they have to put on a good face and they have to, go out there and, pretend that they are feeling great because they had a great game. And this is the wild part about mental health, is that like the two things can be true. You can have a great game and still not feel good. Or you can not feel good, or you can feel really good and not have a good game. Like there's the two sides of the experience, and depending on who you are and what the expectations are, you can go out with a mask and put on a persona that you think is expected of you instead of what you're really experiencing.
Right. Yeah. And then when you don't feel that way, you begin to maybe gaslight yourself, or maybe just not know what to do with it. When you're like, oh my God, I don't feel perfect. It's like the expectation of being an athlete sometimes is like, always be your best. Like, always be your best. And I mean, imagine going to work every day and someone's like, why are you not smiling? Why are you not like clapping? Why are you not like just constantly just nagging things that you're not doing?
Right.
When the reality is maybe you got something going on in your personal life and it's like, okay, like you said, put that mask on. I mean, this happens to adults too, outside of sports, right? Put that mask on because you always have to present yourself a certain way. And those are the people we worry about, actually. For me, in the mental health world, the person who's like pretending like everything's fine and like never admitting that there's any challenges, or always saying like they're perfect and like, don't worry about me, or avoiding it, deflecting. Those are the ones to worry about. It doesn't mean that they definitely have mental health challenges, but it's a sign that sometimes that, because the reality is life is not like that.
Yeah.
And to send the message that you should always be at your best all the time is not realistic.
I want to press pause on that, because I think what we imagine as our best is not always realistic. Like we can't always reach the bar that we have for ourselves, but our best on any given day might be enough, right? My best today might be different than my best tomorrow. But I think that we have this oftentimes, especially as athletes, like an unrealistic expectation that the best is like, you got to be, Michael Jordan every single game, but even his percentage rates weren't 100%, right? And even the top athletes weren't, achieving their top of the top best performance every single time they stepped out into their game, into their sport.
Right. And the ones that last are the ones that can cope with that, you know, and if we're creating this expectation and the ones who can't cope with that because they feel like it's like way too much pressure, like we're losing so many wonderful athletes to that experience. You know, like if we can actually help support these athletes to get through these experiences and not feeling like everything has to be perfect all the time, like we're going to, first of all, they'll last longer in the sport.
Yeah.
You're not going to get burnt out or kind of avoid it or have these spirals that we talked about. So it's actually better for them. You know, I think it's difficult for people to bring this up because, like you said earlier, you know, it's like, are they just not mentally tough? Do they have to get tougher? And it's a hard thing to talk about. That's why, you know, coaches and parents could, you know, check in and try to just really just have a real relationship. I've worked with enough athletes where they feel like if they feel like their coach doesn't actually genuinely care about them as a human being, as an individual, outside of just being someone that is going to make them win the game or make them look good, they know that. Like, it's not, you know, it's like a child. Like a child knows, you know, they pick up on adults. They can kind of feel it. They know what's genuine, what's not. And so, you know, the first and foremost foundation is really to try to really have a trusting, real relationship and go out of your way to prove that that's the case. Because the athletes, believe me, they don't know. They don't know if you really care about them or not. If they feel like it's valid that you don't really care about how they, like what's going on, or they're going to kind of hold back from getting help. They're going to probably feel worse. And there could be a reason why, you know, I think the coaches and parents don't want to bring this topic up is because they're probably afraid of it themselves. You know, they're afraid if I say something, it's going to make it worse, or they're afraid, like, you know, you don't want to open up a can of worms that all of a sudden we're talking about something that they're out of their depth, you know, they're in, you know, the deep water that they don't know how to swim in. So that's why it's like, you know, outsource that to someone, you know, who can help, a professional who can create that space to just, you know, knows how to deal with that stuff. Like part of my job is basically just knowing how to talk about difficult things. My students the other day, I was in class, I was like, look, y'all, like, I hate to break this to you, but like, you got to learn how to help your patients be upset with you. Your job is not to just make them feel better. Everybody in their life is already trying to get them to not be upset. Right? And that's not malintended. That's actually good intended. Like people in their life are trying to help them feel better. But it's not always what they need to work through the depths of what they might be going through. And sometimes you have to feel worse to feel better. And you know, part of therapy is creating a space for people to be authentic and honest about what's going on. Because if you don't have the ability to be honest about what's really going on the inside, you're just scratching the surface. You know, I work with people where it takes time to get to the core of like what's really keeping them stuck. And so you don't want to scratch the surface in therapy. And so, you know, that's just that's a process.
I think that's good advice, not just for parents or coaches of athletes, because I think it's advice for anybody, especially for parents or educators, anybody who's working one-on-one in any relationship, right? Is to not to just jump to problem solving or fear where you walk on eggshells, right? Because I can't tell you how many students that I've worked with who, you know, in tandem of working with me on executive function skills are also working on mental health therapy, where they often will disclose like where their stuck point initially came to light. And I've said this before on the podcast, and I say this often, that most of the time they say that it was the most difficult for them when nobody asked them what was happening for them. Right? Yeah. Where there was clearly a difference in their personality and their energy level and the way they were interacting and engaging in different aspects of their lives. And people just like kind of just were like, well, they're doing good enough. It's okay. Right? Instead of, you know, just checking in, right? Just being curious. And again, if you're out of your depth and something comes up that doesn't feel comfortable, I always remind parents especially, I'm like, you don't need to problem solve everything. And dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, I think has a really great way of helping parents especially to manage these situations, is to really just ask what you need, right? And say, you know, do you need me to just listen? Do you need me to validate your experience, or do you want me to help you problem solve? Because I think in different situations and contexts, that's the case. And we don't always all have the answers. Even in therapy, I'm sure you've told your students before that we don't always have every answer to every question and every dilemma that comes up. But really, the process is for helping the person that's sitting with you in front of you to be reflective on the experience, to be able to, again, gain a little bit more awareness as to how whatever the question, the situation, the concern and challenge might be is impacting them. Yeah. So you can figure out what comes next.
And to really just understand it, right? And there could be multiple components that are contributing to it, right? I mean, and what a person needs cannot be clear sometimes, right?
We often don't know what we need, even as adults, right?
No. And so I
joke this is where cursing comes in. When people curse, it's like they don't really know how to articulate the discomfort that they're feeling. So they just, throw out an expletive.
That's very wise of you. So true. But yeah, there's so many components that can go into it, and dealing with this mental health stuff, it doesn't mean that you don't, sometimes it could be a signal that the person needs to step away and go in a different direction, right? But I think maybe the fear is okay, you begin to talk about these mental health things, and all of a sudden they're gonna not take on challenges anymore. And they're going to not have structure anymore because they're not going to be participating the way they used to, right? But that's not, sometimes that is the case. Sometimes the situation they're in is just unhealthy and they need to kind of step away from what they're doing or go into a different maybe team or a different sporting environment because it's unhealthy for them, if that's part of it. But that's not always part of it, right? The whole point is that you learn about yourself. Therapy is all about learning about it. It's in the class I was talking to my students. They're like, my patient went through a breakup. I'm like, don't focus on who's to blame for the breakup. Just focus on what did the person learn about themselves and about relationships in general through that. So the same thing here, whether the person stays with their sport or makes a kind of a slight turn in a different direction or joins a different, whatever it is, where they stay with their team. The point is that they're learning about themselves and they take that learning into other aspects of their life. And so there's a really important point that I'd like to make about athlete mental health is that when they're coming to me and they have some sort of mental health concern, that's not just they have butterflies, but it's a legitimate distress, highly distressing, impairing part of their sport. Usually it's related to other aspects of their life. And I think this is maybe a not totally understood aspect of mental health. It's not always the case, but because some performance situations are so out of the ordinary that it's maybe anybody would feel that, these downhill skiers were
oh my gosh,
doing the most incredible / dangerous things. You can imagine that could create crippling anxiety for anybody if you kind of if your mind starts to wander in a direction that maybe is not helpful, right? But at the same time, what I have found is that, athletes, when they bring in their mental health concerns as it relates to their sport, it tends to reflect other areas of their life because, they are who they are wherever they are. So I have found how wonderful and what a blessing it's been for me to work with athletes going through very hard times in their sport. And as they come out on the other end of their therapy, they grow and they evolve and they heal as a person and in many ways become, quote unquote better. I don't want to say the word better, but more whole as a person. Evolved because of the challenge, not despite it. Because the challenge was almost like a wake up call. Okay, there's patterns I have within me that either led me to get into this point and I don't want to continue those patterns, or maybe there's patterns I have that led me to tolerate things that I shouldn't tolerate, or maybe there's hurt that I had that people were hurting me, because, there's abusive things that happen and maybe I actually needed to heal from that and have support. So it's really, because of these challenges that people can become more whole, not despite them.
Two things that you just brought up that I just want to highlight that are so important is one, imagine if an athlete just scored every single shot that they ever took, right? I don't know if they would really find too much enjoyment in that. It probably would become super isolating. And I'm sure the top athletes couldn't say that.
Yeah.
Like, it must be really hard to be the leading scorer, to be the best of the best, right? Especially when you're working and playing on a team. Like, that brings about additional challenges from like a social perspective. And as I say to my students all the time, I'm like, it would be really boring just to be like the best at everything I tried the first time I tried it. Like, there's something enjoyable. There's something that's so fulfilling about, working towards something that's new or is challenging or is elevating you to the next level.
Yeah.
There's something that builds character in the struggle, in the persistence, in the tweaking and learning and adjusting as you go. And with that also comes, like, it's very difficult to do that. Like, you do need to build some mental resilience, I'm going to say, instead of toughness, right? There needs to be this resilience of being able to shift and adjust when you notice things aren't going the way you intend or you expect them to. And there's really nothing wrong with that process. It's actually a beautiful one. I think that's one of the greatest aspects of being human, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes back to why sports could be such a beautiful thing, is that it could be a healthy version of that.
Totally.
And it could bring out some wonderful qualities in people. When it comes to mental health and, people have mental health struggles, it's really important to understand that everybody's different. And so, one person, athlete A, may thrive in this environment, right, for X, Y, Z reasons. And athlete B may flounder. And does that mean that athlete A is a better person or a better athlete than athlete B? No, it could be circumstantial. So athlete B who's struggling, maybe they just have a predisposition to having a really sensitive stress response, and they're just easily activated emotionally. Right? And they have a hard time regulating that. But their talent is the same as athlete A. Their skill set, their drive, their tenacity, whatever it is, right? That doesn't mean that athlete A is better than athlete B. It just means that they're different. And that's why understanding mental health, and there's plenty of other examples of how two athletes could look different, right? One could come from, an environment that is extremely highly pressured, right? And so they could perhaps have this kind of predisposition based on maybe they grew up in an environment where it's like, you always have to be perfect. You always have to be on, you can't think about your own feelings, your own needs, and you just neglect everything about yourself. So you just kind of sacrifice your health and just for the sake of winning. Winning's everything. Let's imagine that. All you got to do is win. Look out for yourself only. Don't worry about other people. Just win, right? If you grew up in an environment that modeled this, whether it's socially, familiar, culturally, your neighborhood, whatever, or trauma that you had. Some people who grew up with trauma, they kind of developed this survival instinct, right? That person, that athlete is going to have a very different experience from athlete A, who's kind of just like, I'm just here. I'm going to get the most out of this experience. I'm having fun. Athlete B doesn't mean they're a worse person. They just have a completely different makeup. And they may need support with that. And they may be equally as valuable to the team. They may also have qualities that athlete A doesn't even have because of what they went through. Maybe they can grow from it and have a depth of empathy if they can kind of like grow from challenging experiences or whatever qualities they have. And so it's important when you think about mental health is it's not just like being resilient. It's like trying to understand that everybody's different. And resiliency will look very different. Athlete A may just need a pep talk. Athlete B may need, extra support or just a different approach in terms of the relationship that they have with the coach.
It's very UDL of you, Jerry.
Yeah, it's true.
Right? It's not just learner variability, it's athlete variability. And the way in which they learn and adjust and take feedback or coach themselves as they're being coached might look a little bit different, and they might need something different. You touched upon three things that I want to dive into a little bit. Hang tight because we're going to come back to expand upon this. Number one is thinking about the identity of an athlete who often that takes up such a big part of their world.
Oh, yeah.
And I do a lot of work with the people I work with too around this. The things that you value might be closely related to your role as an athlete.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to you than just that. And we'll dive into that. The other piece is this idea of the environmental factors that might play a role in how an athlete shapes their identity, and this idea of perfectionism. And I suggest that anybody in the audience who's interested in any of the things we talk about, go back and listen to the perfectionism episodes, because this idea of like, are you like fueling and directing yourself from a place of fear because you feel like you have to prove something? Or are you doing it from a place of more, I always say intuition, but it might just be wisdom, right? To know, okay, this is the path I know I need to take to become better. And it does take a lot of self-sacrifice, which could look like perfectionism, but there's a line between the two. And then the last piece is, and I think this all goes together, Jerry, so I'm sure your response will weave it in. The last piece is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, you know, we might tweak our nutrition to meet some of our goals. We might tweak our movement, our conditioning. We might tweak our coaching. We might tweak our routines and habits as we're trying to improve ourselves as an athlete. But I see mental health as one of those aspects of things that we need to check in with and potentially make little adjustments to, rather than feeling like it's all or nothing, like I'm at peak mental health or I'm really struggling.
Yeah, so there's two parts. One is the identity part, which I'll touch upon first, and the second is that perfectionism, and sports definitely pulls for perfectionism. I mean, everything's about control. It's like control your body. Control what your body looks like, control what your body's able to do. Like, that's a slippery slope.
Well, especially slippery slope when you're doing really difficult, challenging, dangerous things like the Winter Olympics that we just experienced in 2026.
And that's why I think sports is very challenging to understand the nuances of mental health versus being mentally healthy and being mentally unhealthy, right? Because as you were saying, you do need to control your body, right? And then
you do need a level of perfection.
Yes.
Or you know, what do we say? The asymptote, getting close to perfection.
Yeah, the asymptote metaphor that I came up with. Yeah,
as close as we can get to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so like, it's a slippery slope because if you really don't know what that line in the sand is between like, this is obsessive, this is compulsive versus this is actually me just doing something that's healthy for me, it's a very hard thing to really delineate. And that's why, you know, having honest conversations and also having people around you to validate that this is actually hard. You know, if you got people in your life that are like, you got the nutritionist, you got the strength and conditioning coach, like if everyone's kind of giving you this like perfection message, like everything's got to be perfect, and as opposed to just being honest that, hey, like it's hard to know what perfect quote unquote nutrition and strength and all this stuff for your body is. Like, I think if we can just be honest about that, that just helps them to be honest with themselves and maybe prevent them from just reactively just going down the rabbit hole of like obsessing over everything and looking at every Instagram reel about like what's going to make their body better. Like there's a million things out there, right?
Well, this is the other thing too. And thinking about, and I'm not an expert in this, but we've talked about this on the podcast before about, you know, sometimes our body metabolizes things differently. There isn't just like, you know, you have to have this amount of protein and supplements and this and that.
There's no one size fits all.
There's no one size fits all. And like all of these messages that we're hearing, it's so nuanced, right? We want to be careful not to just say, oh, this expert told me to do this and that's what I have to do. Yeah. We need to also be in tune with our bodies, just as we want to be in tune with our minds and our hearts.
You know, let's bring this back to your point about identity, right? If your identity revolves around doing these things perfectly, which in turn lead you to think that that's why you're performing so well. Yeah. Which, by the way, you can do all these things and actually perform worse if your body's not nurtured the right way, if you're overdoing it, if you're not, you know, eating disordered kind of things could happen where you're actually hurting your body. You don't even realize it. But all this is to say is that if this becomes your identity, it's a transactional version of getting validation from people. And that's why sports becomes a slippery slope sometimes, especially with the professionalism of it. The brand, you know, the NIL is a wonderful thing for people to get compensated for their efforts and for, you know, what they feel like they deserve. At the same time, You know, if you would kind of zoom out and think of the NIL as just like everybody is trying to have a brand, everybody's trying to like be famous in some way so that they can get money, right? Everything becomes transactional. And I want to bring that back to your idea of identity. Identity in its most healthy form, in my opinion, comes from self-love and genuine relationships. And I've heard athletes say, and some of the students in the program have commented on this as well, like when do athletes get to just be themselves without doing something for someone else?
Well, you mentioned this before about trust, right? Trusting in the coach. And I think a big part of it also is trusting in yourself, right? I see athlete development in helping athletes know themselves, know their bodies and their limits, and being able to trust themselves, trusting the people around them, but also ultimately trusting themselves to know when they are feeling mentally healthy, physically healthy, physically ready. And I say physically in like the nutritional, the sleep hygiene, the hydration, you know, a lot of these things that fall off that some top athletes, we've talked about this before, I've heard on different podcasts, talking about how they just had these great skills that they didn't tend to these other aspects of themselves. They just kept going because they were getting lauded for their skills rather than them really thinking about how to care for themselves.
And the same thing emotionally, right? You just kind of push through without really knowing what your emotional needs are. So let me bring that back to what you were saying before about intuition. We want people to kind of have more of an intuition as to, you know, what's going on inside of them, what do they need. And athletes are constantly, if not almost always, told what to do.
Yeah, it's true.
So we talked about this in the Psychology of Coaching episode with Dr. John McCarthy, our good friend and colleague, who basically was like, you know, there's research on this, and he kind of did his own observations and his own research of like, you know, coaches are just constantly telling the athletes what to do, and they're not asking any questions. And so this is a slippery slope because of your point, is when someone is just compliant. And by the way, some of the best coaches, quote unquote, most successful coaches will have athletes who will listen to anything they will say, that will run through a wall for them because they were told to, and they don't want to let the coach down. And to me, that is actually a selection bias. I want people to think about that. These coaches are selecting athletes who will be compliant, right? They're fitting their system of like, they're going to do what I tell them to do. I'm not putting these coaches down. Like, they're successful, they're doing, you know, if they're developing, you know, good, you know, young men and women, that's great. Whatever it is. Successful
in relation to winning, or like a percentage of how well they're doing and achieving versus you know, what you and I think success is like this holistic approach of developing individuals.
And that's why this is such a tricky, sticky subject, because in some circles, in some cultures, not even in sports, and just some cultures, like that is success. That's a healthy individual. They're being successful. They're getting the most out of their potential. They're doing what they're told. They're complying with a larger collective, right? That's kind of a collectivistic, like, you know, to don't ruffle feathers, kind of, you know, fit the system and do your job, do what you're supposed to do. I'm not here to say like that's wrong, but like if there's indications that that's actually leading people to become mentally unhealthy, then we should be looking at that.
It's like, at what expense, right?
At what expense?
Yeah. It's like this could be helpful. And in fact, and indeed, there are some really beautiful protective factors and relationships with coaches and teams that have worked well.
Yeah.
And, you know, we want to be mindful that athletes are also humans. They have more to their lives than just the sport in that exact moment.
Exactly. And when you actually work with these athletes and you hear them be honest, because they have a hard time being honest with their coach to say, hey, like, actually, I'm injured. They hide injuries.
Oh, and concussions. This is a big one.
Concussions, they hide issues that they have, like legitimate issues. They hide the fact that like their grades are struggling. Like, there's any possible which way that this can go.
I'm going to add in also, because we talked about this on an episode as well, is, you know, thinking about gender differences too. Females in their menstrual cycles might have different capacities and different needs at different times. And, I always joke with my female athletes I work with, I'm like, nobody ever taught us about this, right? There's actually different things we should be doing and eating and being mindful of that sometimes get overlooked because you have to get ready for a certain game or competition. And, the timing doesn't always sync up literally with where you are in your life and in your world and your body.
And these coaches, as Dr. John McCarthy said, have so much pressure on them to succeed. So it's kind of a cycle, right? It doesn't mean that they're bad people, but like the system is kind of pushing them to be successful. There's a loser job and their career depends on it, right? They can have a mediocre team and have like mentally healthy athletes, but they may lose their job because they're not winning, right? So it's a system. I get it. I understand it. But you make a very good point though, that, like paying attention to your needs. There's a New York Times article that just came out. It was wonderful about how young female athletes, they call it kind of almost an epidemic of ACL injuries.
Yeah, there's interesting research around that.
And it's exploded more than males, right? And so, there's theories.
It's become more frequent.
Way more frequent, right? To the point of like, this is like not good, right? And so there's theories about why that is. And one of the theories is actually that there's plenty of preventative measures and exercises that have been well developed, well studied, very effective for preventing these injuries. And all you have to do is to just know that they exist, number one, and number two, implement them consistently for your athletes. The problem is that the coaches may not be aware of it, or they may not feel like it's a priority or the time that they have to be able to implement something like this. But those who do, there's an athlete who I know who said, that actually made a tremendous difference on our team once we started doing that. So.
But I think this is important to say because, ACL injuries has become more prevalent, especially with female athletes. Concussions, really grateful to the work Dr. Chris Nowinski and his colleagues are doing at the Concussion Legacy Foundation to talk about, what are the implications of what happens later. But there's a lot of really great research out there. So if you're a coach or you're a parent that wants to just be more educated, there's a limit to being overeducated and knowing too much, and then you try to control too many situations. But just being familiar and aware enough. This is why we do these podcasts, right? How much is enough? But you want to just be familiar so you can recognize what might be needed. Because there's a lot of really great research, a lot of great foundations out there, and a lot of great coaches and parents alike, and athletes who are beginning to advocate for themselves to say, listen, I really want to get to this level, and I'm noticing that, right? To make sure that they're protecting themselves. And I always say, I'm like, if you're going to continue to play injured, or even from an academic perspective, if you're going to just burn yourself out studying all night, right, you might do okay. But if you don't, it's not just impacting you individually in this one moment. It might be impacting some, your future self, your team, these other aspects of whatever's happening. It's like we need to weigh these pros and cons because, again, coming back to executive functions in the frontal lobe, especially young athletes, can't always see their future selves, their future situations, and how one decision potentially can impact a longer aspect or greater aspect of their lives.
Absolutely. And I can't emphasize enough, this athlete identity is so powerful. I mean, you got to look at social media, the way it's built now, that the professionalism of sports and the way the exposure is and the recruitment cycles, this identity is so powerful for these athletes. And if you don't have any type of grounding, it makes them fragile. We just talked about ACL injuries. You get an injury, you're out. Let's say it's for a year or a half a year or your whole career. You can't play the sport anymore. It is devastating for the person. And obviously, this type of injury is going to be painful and emotionally upsetting to anybody. It's just like, that's part of being human. But if you have every aspect of your being wrapped up in being an athlete, but not only being an athlete, but this image of how they think they should be and how people should perceive them to, be a certain way. And that's reinforced by people telling them how great they are and telling them, like, and everything rides on whether or not they played well or did well, right? Like they don't, and they don't play well and they get criticized, right? Or they get neglected, like there's artists, there's musicians, there's famous, like one day they're on the top of the world and one day nobody even remembers who they are. There's so many athletes. I was actually just thinking about this like a month ago. I was like who played in the Super Bowl in 2007? Like I'm sure at the time I was like, oh, these guys are amazing. I totally remember that guy.
2007, you do remember.
Sorry. Oh yeah, that's a sensitive topic here in Boston.
Yeah, we're gonna be careful.
Right. There may be one or two people I remember from that.
I think that might have been one of the best Super Bowls of all time. Interesting you chose that year.
That is funny. Yeah.
But maybe 2006 has gotten outshadowed by 2007.
Oh, that's funny. That's so funny. But how many other athletes are there besides Tom Brady, Eli Manning, and the guy with the helmet catch? Right. There's so many.
Tyree.
There's so you just and these are human beings, right?
Yep.
Where if they wrap themselves up in this identity so much, and look, they have reasons for it. Some of them, like I said, like that's their way of having income. Like, and they feel like I have no other skills. Like this is the best I can do to have income, and I can make a lot of money. Like I get that, but like. It becomes such a fragility. And I really want to point this out. Like if you have all your eggs in one basket and that's everything you get your external validation from, you have no real sense of loving yourself outside of this, it's fragile. And the moment that fragility gets shattered or there's like a crack in it, that's when, people are going to need support. And like, we can't prevent that from happening. Like, but at least we can be aware that people can need support and try to prevent it too. And bolster people to feel good about themselves outside of this kind of matrix. It's kind of like one of the athletes that I know, she said, just remind everybody that being an athlete, it's not that deep. Like, I know it seems like it, everything's wrapped up in it and people are celebrating you, but just remember it's not that deep.
You bring up such a good point, and I want to touch on this and then kind of wrap up thinking about how do we sum up some of the suggestions we have for people in the lives of athletes or athletes themselves who might be listening. But I just want to double click on this point because I took a sports psychology course in undergrad, and I'll never forget, it was little me with a bunch of football players and other athletes in the class. And we were talking a lot about, these college athletes who might get signed to play professionally and leave college behind to move forward professionally. And it brought about a perspective that, isn't my experience, right? That a lot of these athletes, some of their voices that I'll just quickly share and definitely not do justice to what they were sharing. A lot of them were sharing that, they're like, if I get a shot to make money to play a sport, I have to take it. Yeah. My parents have invested in me, or I've worked so hard because I have this skill and everybody's expecting me to take care of them. They become lauded in a community that a lot of times might be underserved or might not be appreciated for who they are. Yeah. And then this one athlete comes out of this space and it kind of lifts everybody up, not just them. Yeah. And it's a lot of pressure to support the environment and the families and the community and the collective. That, again, puts additional stress and pressure on them outside of even just your own personal pressure because you want to be the best or you want to achieve or you love playing and doing whatever you do athletically. It's so interesting. And from a mental health perspective, I wonder if you could just quickly speak to that before we wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, so someone who experiences something like that, forgive me if I'm not using the right word, but there's a desperation to it. And when someo's desperate... It
goes back to flight or fight, almost like survival.
Survival, right?
Yeah.
And
literally survival.
And here's the bigger context of that. Someone like that is more likely to be manipulated.
Potentially, yeah. That's a huge vulnerability.
And it may not even be intentional. But if that person is recruited to a very, very demanding, hard-nosed coach that is going to expect them to do whatever they tell them to do for the sake of winning. Maybe certain people benefit from that structure.
Right.
right? There are, right?
We talked about this a little bit with Coach Mac too.
Yeah, like maybe there are some who benefit from having that structure because psychologically that maybe they had no structure, or maybe they didn't have that kind of figure in their life to kind of like do whatever they like. In some ways that's care to them, right? Oh, this person cares about me. They're going to get the best out of me. They're going to do whatever it takes.
They're going to push me.
They're going to push me. That means they care, right? So let me just set the stage for that. At the same time, there could be situations, like this is nuance. It's not all or nothing. This is not a one size fits all. But
most certainly not for everybody in this situation.
Exactly. But there could be, because obviously this talk is about athlete mental health. Why? That's the reason I'm bringing this up. There could be someone who's vulnerable, where they may push themselves too hard. They may neglect themselves. They may not care about grades because they're trying to please their coach. They may...
Or they may not have the skills to match the level that they're being asked to work at academically. I see this a lot too, where programs will bring students that maybe don't qualify academically for the school, but they want them on their teams. And not all schools have a great like educational support system,
right,
especially for the athletes, which, you know,
well,
it's another talk for another time, but
I mean, there are schools who do provide
there are
that.
some that are really great. Don't get me wrong, but it has to be a balance, and that's again another pressure point. Is why I bring it up.
But at the very least, what I'm saying is like that person could be vulnerable to all these things we've talked about of like putting all their investment in their identity, in how they feel about themselves, and let's say that athlete gets injured, very vulnerable. Very vulnerable. There's tragedies that have happened to athletes like this. I don't want to like really bring it up here, but tragedies because of this type of dynamic, right? So we want to really try to see these athletes as human beings, as individuals, with histories, with backgrounds, with things that they're bringing in, vulnerabilities. There's so many reasons why someone could have mental health challenges. I don't really want to spend time getting into like what contributes to mental health challenges. We'll maybe have an episode on that. But it's not just one thing. It's not like, oh, that person, is soft, or that person is sensitive. It's the
nature-nurture balance, right? In psychology too.
It's complicated too.
It's so complex. Everything is.
I mean, it's complicated. Like there's reasons that you may have no idea about a particular person, right? It's not as simple as like, oh, they just have symptoms of anxiety or depression. Like there could be a lot wrapped up in what's going on inside of them that it takes time to understand and figure out. So all this to say is be kind, be gentle. It doesn't mean they don't push people. Like there's too much dichotomous talk about like either people are too soft or too hard. Like that's missing the point. Like anything could be a good idea that you take it out of context. It's not a good idea anymore, right? You take this idea of like, oh, kids are too soft. Okay, like maybe there's some truth to the fact that kids need to be like pushed a little bit more and not be
build that resilience and persistence.
Build resilience, not act entitled, right? But to me, first of all, like entitlement and that kind of stuff, that could be masking insecurities, that could be masking other anxieties that they're not admitting, and we're just talking about the behavior, not talking about the core, the reason for it.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's being modeled to them around them, or their influences on social media. Like there's reasons for this behavior. Let's try to understand what's leading to it and address it. But secondly, like I think we need to be careful with this dichotomous talk about things are either this way or that way. Both sides could have some truth to it, and you want to just understand the context, right? Like pushing someone extremely hard could be good for one person, but for another person, as I said before, like they could be vulnerable to, like that could be detrimental to them. And
great point.
They both may end up in the same spot and be successful in their own way and reach their potential, but they may need different things to get there, just like, UDL would say.
Really great points. Okay, so closing thoughts. As we always think about, what are you looking forward to in the future? What are you hopeful for in terms of better understanding athlete mental health?
The fact that there is more talk about it is very, very door opening for people. And to destigmatize the fact that like we struggle, and I'd like to reframe this as like we're human, like maybe we're just realizing that we're human. Maybe instead of being like this is a stigma or not a stigma, it's like let's just say like, hey, we're human, and like stuff happens. It's always happened. This is not new.
And in a world of AI and all this like new technology, we are not machines. And in fact, I don't think we want to be.
No,
I would argue we're trying to keep our humanity, and these ups and downs are part of that.
Totally, yeah. I'm hopeful that people could get into their life journey and see life as a journey. And we're all learning different lessons. We're all learning about ourselves. We're all, figuring out what this segment of life is about for us. What are we learning from it? How do we grow? How do we evolve? How do we have joy in what we're doing and find that? How do we just make things a little bit better? If you're listening to this, maybe you become a coach, like do it a little bit differently. If you're a teacher, if you're this or that, like whatever. If you've seen things happen in ways that you didn't love, like try to just do a little bit better. Like don't obsess over it. Sometimes you can kind of like overcorrect. It's like, okay, like don't overcorrect. But, just try, like there's always hope, there's always tomorrow. There's always the ability to make things a little bit better. Even if society seems like it's falling apart, like you help one person, you help one athlete, you help, one person, one teammate, you help yourself. Like that's something. We're all living these lives.
I appreciate that. And just a last final thought, there's this idea of resonance that we talk about, like, did that resonate? Did that resonate? But I think in my mind, resonance is like when we take some action to improve or do a little bit better, or at least build that awareness that leads to something that improves or works towards optimization or enhancement in the world, either personally or in a grander way.
Yeah.
The resonance in that one action can spill outward.
Thank you, Lex. Thanks for the interview. It's awesome.
And for everyone, be well.
Thanks for tuning in to the ReidConnect-Ed podcast. Please remember that this is a podcast intended to educate and share ideas, but it is not a substitute for professional care that may be beneficial to you at different points of your life. If you are in need of support, please contact your primary care physician, local hospital, educational institution, or support staff at your place of employment to seek out referrals for what may be most helpful for you. Ideas shared here have been shaped by many years of training, incredible mentors, research, theory, evidence-based practices, and our work with individuals over the years, but it's not intended to represent opinions of those we work with or who we are affiliated with. The ReidConnect-Ed podcast is hosted by siblings Alexis Reid and Dr. Gerald Reid. Original music is written and recorded by Gerald Reid. The recording was done by Cybersound Studios. If you want to follow along on this journey with us, the ReidConnect-Ed podcast will be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks each season. So please subscribe for updates and notifications. Feel free to also follow us on Instagram at ReidConnect-Ed podcast. That's ReidConnect-Ed podcast, and Twitter at ReidConnect-Ed. We are grateful for you joining us and look forward to future episodes. In the meanwhile, be curious, be open, and be well.